Welcome to Practical Sea School. Today we're going to be looking at 7 of the most useful knots for sailing, and they're also the 7 knots which you have to know for your competent crew course. So this may be homework for some of you. Before we get into the knots themselves, I want to look at the different parts which make up the forming of a knot. So this is our practice line. It's a lovely supple 16mm line, and this here is the working end. And this is going to be doing the ducking and diving and going through the loops to form your knots. Now, sometimes people call this the running end, but I prefer working. Over here is the standing part of your line. Now, that could be 50 meters long, so you don't want to be making your knots out of the standing part. That's meant to just sit there. Otherwise, you're going to be pulling 50 meters of line through each loop, which takes an awful long time. Ideally, you want to be doing it with 1 meter, perhaps 2 meters if you're making a big loop at the end of that, which is your working end. If you don't have a working end available to you, of course, then you can always do many of these knots on a bight. Now, here's a bight in the middle of your line, and you can form a knot in there. We'll be having a look at some examples of those later. The other thing I want you to think about is loops, but not just any loops. It's about which direction you make them. So here is an overhand loop. Now, it's called an overhand loop because the working end is going over the standing part. An underhand loop, on the other hand, is where the working end is under the standing end. Now, it's important, if I try and do a bowline now out of this with an underhand loop, the whole thing falls apart. If, on the other hand, I do a bowline, and we're going to be looking closely at bowlines in a minute, so don't worry if you're not following this. If I do a bowline now with an overhand knot, it forms beautifully. Now, finally, I want to talk about tails. Now, the length of the tail is crucial because if it's too short, as the line loads up, it can pull through. The guide for the length of a tail, which works on all sizes, thicknesses of line, is that basically it can't stand up on its own accord. So actually that would be okay, and I've given it a little bit extra, which there's nothing wrong with. Right, with those things for you to bear in mind, let's look at our first knot. The first knot we're going to look at is the bowline, and it's probably the most used knot on board. It's used for tying sheets to the sails, for reefing pennants. If I'm tying a dinghy to the boat, I'd probably use a bowline over perhaps some of the other knots we're looking at later, just because I know it's going to be really secure. It's so important to get the first bit of the bowline right. If you don't, it's not going to work. And as I mentioned in the introduction, what we're after is a overhand loop like that, where the working end is going over the standing part. Once you've got that right, you're really home dry, because then all you've got to do is come up through that loop from underneath, go round the standing part and go back down the way you came, through that overhand loop. That can be pulled really tight now, and to undo it, you can simply break the back of it by pulling that loop there. Now, what I've done here is I've done the tail here, which is a suitable length. I've done the tail here on the inside. You have the option of doing it on the outside. The reason I have a slight preference for the tail being on the inside rather than here is because it's less likely to catch. So if I'm tying a sheet onto a sail, for example, and it's being dragged round all the rigging at the front of a boat, this tail can sometimes get caught, and it's less likely to if it's on the inside than on the outside. A really useful knot. You want to practice it so you can tie it pretty much with your eyes closed, because you're probably going to have to do it in the dark sometime. So let's have a look at the figure of 8 knot, and the figure of 8 knot is a stopper knot. So you'd have them in the end of halyards, for example, so that they didn't get pulled up through the mast if you dropped a sail. And in the end of sheets like this is our head sail sheet, And this isn't actually a figure of 8, this is an Admiralty stopper knot, but it serves the same purpose, so that if the sails are let fly, then this will get caught in the block on the track, and you can still pull in the sails. You don't lose the sheets to the sails. So really simple knot to tie. What we start with is an overhand loop, so the working end is over the standing end, and then you simply take the working end round the back of the standing part and then drop it through that loop you created first of all. It's a really easy to identify knot because it looks like a figure of 8, and they can pull quite tight and be difficult to undo, but if you bend them around a bit, normally they can undo pretty easily, even after they've been loaded up. Let's have a look at the Clow Hitch. Now, generally the Clow Hitch is used for tying things onto other things. So you might be tying something onto this push bit here, or you might be tying a fender onto the guardrail. And it's a really useful one for fenders, actually. It's also the knot I use to secure the tiller down the centre line of the boat, although not with a big thick line like this. But anyway, what you do is start by going over and creating a turn. You then cross the standing part here, and then go under and pass the working end underneath where you've just crossed. The lovely thing about a Clow Hitch is that, let's say I want to adjust the height of a fender, you can always just pull in a little bit extra from over there and adjust the height. So it's really useful if you're coming alongside a lock wall and then going into your marina berth with having to drop them down for the height of the pontoons. If you are leaving it for a while, you may wish to get an extra little bit of security on a Clow Hitch by adding a hitch to it. I've never had a Clow Hitch give way in the past, but nothing wrong with putting an extra hitch in for peace of mind. Let's look at the round turn and 2/2 hitches. Now, this is a really useful knot to use if you suspect at all that you're going to have to release it under load. And I noticed recently that quite a few of the French skippers in the Vendée Globe, they tie their boats off at the end of the day when they're putting their boat to bed. They tie onto the pontoon cleat a round turn and 2/2 hitches, rather than what we'd normally do in this country, which would be a bowline. The advantage is that if that line is loaded up, then they can release it under control. It's a really easy knot to tie, and it's actually really crucial if we just discuss quickly what a round turn is and why it's important to know about a full round turn. Now, this is a normal turn here, line's going round once, and the problem with this, if you're going onto a mooring buoy with a ring on it and you just put a turn on it like this, then that can chafe ever so easily, and actually over a few hours with some choppy conditions can actually chafe through your mooring line. If you do a round turn though for your mooring line, then that really locates it, secures it, and takes away that movement, so that's a lot less likely to chafe. So that's a full round turn. Essentially you go round twice like that. That's a round turn. Then you can do your hitches to secure it. So that's just a hitch round the standing part, and then another one of those. Getting a bit short on line, so I'll give myself a little bit extra now. Let's do that hitch again round the standing part, and again, and then that's nice and secure. Now, if you wanted to, there's nothing stopping you doing another one of those to secure that even further. And if I was using it to tie a boat to a dock, I probably would. But now, if I want to release that, I can load that up like that. I can take out that second hitch. I can take out that first hitch, keeping the tension on the round turn. And if this was really loaded up, I can now ease that under complete control. Really useful sometimes to have that in your toolbox of knots. Let's have a look at the reef knot, or in the States this is called the square knot. And it's a knot which you use for tying similar sized lines together. Now, there's an easy way of remembering how to tie a reef knot, and that's left over right, right over left. And the left and right refers to your hands, nothing else. So let's walk through it. I've got our blue line here in the left hand, and we've got white line, exactly the same thickness of line, in my right hand. So we take the left hand and we go over the one in the right hand and then under. That's the first part. We then take the line in my right hand, go over the one on the left and then under, pull it tight. And that's your reef knot. Very easy to undo because actually you can just apply pressure to them together and the two loops will start to come apart. And we use the reef knot for, well, tidying up a reef once we've tucked a reef in, for example. But if you've got two lines of different thicknesses, then you have to use something else, and that's what we're going to look at next. Let's have a look at the sheet bend, and a sheet bend is used to tie two different thicknesses of line together. If you're next on a ferry, look when you dock and you'll see a thin line being thrown to the shore to the dock crew. And on the end of that thin line will be the thick, heavy mooring lines, which you could never throw, they're far too heavy. So these are used regularly on big boats, these knots. Let's have a look at it. So here is our big, thick dock line, which is too heavy to throw. And in it, we're going to form a bight. Just like that. We take our thin throwing line, if you like, and we pass that through the bight. So the working end then goes underneath the bight and then underneath the working part of the thin line. Now, what people tend to do with this knot is overcomplicate it. It's actually really, really simple. If you want it to be a little bit more secure, what you can do is do a double sheet bend really easily. And all you do to do that is you go back round again and then pass the working end underneath the working part of the thin line. And that's just a bit of added security. The rolling hitch is essentially a friction knot, and it's a really useful friction knot because it's directional, so it'll lock in one way and be free in the other. And that's really important to think about when you're tying it. The main purpose that it's used for on board a boat is to free up a riding turn on a winch. And you can tie a rolling hitch onto the sheet, onto that line going onto that winch, tension it up, and that will mean you can undo that riding turn. So let's actually look at it in situ here. Let's imagine that in this case, this is a really nasty riding turn. It's completely jammed up, can't go in, you can't pull it in anymore, and that line is bar tight. So what you do, and it's really good to have a line around just coiled on the push pit, which is for this purpose. So I want to be pulling in this direction, and I may want to slide it in that direction. So I take my line and I do a turn, and then I do another turn, and those two turns are in the direction that you want to pull it in. You then cross over and go under and back through. Now the beauty of this is if I want to, I can slide it forward, but as soon as I start to pull it back, it locks in. And this is why it's useful to do it with a slightly thinner line than the one you're going onto. It works a lot better. If you do it with two lines which are the same thickness, it doesn't work very well. Let's take this line now back to this winch, just here. Get a nice few turns on this because there's plenty of space to get a few turns, and just cinch this up, and straight away you can see how this has now taken the load. I could cleat that off if it was a little bit longer, and then from there I can work on that winch in complete safety, knowing that this is taking the load off that sheet. I then sort out that line. I could then tension this up if I wanted to take the line back off there, knowing that the tension is taken up by our new line. You can sort out a problem, get that riding turn off, ease that back on, and you can carry on sailing.